So far, kind of like this last section, right? We have our like Flask app. Um, we have this, app equals this Flask thing. And then what we did was, we develop it locally, and we deployed this on AWS, right? And so we first kind of saw how to deploy this directly in the cloud, right? Can I show? This is the cloud, right? And this is onto AWS. And then we saw how, let me write out AWS. And then we saw how to Dockerize this, right? So we, built an image. And then remember by like copying over the relevant files, copying over the library, running, pip3 install requirements, booting this thing up. And, the next step would be essentially to, I don't think we have you do it all, but the next step would be essentially just push, like install Docker here on your EC2 instance. Install Docker on your EC2 instance, and then have that connection point to your RDS, right? This is our Amazon hosted Postgres database. Right, so we develop locally, we Dockerize it, we have this EC2 machine, and then you would essentially do Docker pull and pull down that Docker image, and then do Docker run to run it, and then connect to the RDS database. So this RDS database, this is like our transactional database, right? And this is in that OLTP, meaning like normalized style. And then essentially what we want to do next is we want a way to migrate this over to our analytics database with that OLAP structure. Okay. And there's different ways, and this will be our, it could be Snowflake. For now, we've used Snowflake before. Here we're going to use Redshift. And there's different ways that we can kind of like do this. I'll show you kind of what we'll build up to. Ultimately, what we're going to need to do is not only, we're going to need to like select this data from our RDS instance, right? Like meaning like we can do like select, maybe, remember we have like this Foursquare data set. So maybe we can like select all from cities or something like that. But we not only need to like select the data, and so we can select all from cities, and then we can export this to a CSV, right? So we can just get like a CSV, think of it like an Excel sheet. You all have seen CSV files. And we can export this like on our computer, and then from our laptop, move this data over to Redshift. So that would be like the first step. Then the second step would be perform the selection. And instead of go directly to Redshift, I guess we'll store it on something called like S3. It's just like a way, it's just like Dropbox. It's like a holding pattern, and that's called staging. But like I said, this staging step. You can think of it, the technology S3, and we'll work with this, essentially as like Dropbox, right? Like that, you just file storage. You can store any file you want on it. And we'll take the CSV file, store it on S3, and then from S3, we'll move the data over to Redshift. Okay, so that's like kind of step 2. So the first step is just, we do this thing in like stages. The first stage would be, okay, take your data, your transactional data, export it to a CSV, on your laptop, then move it over to this new database, Redshift. Second stage is maybe like, okay, select this data from S3, from RDS. And then from your laptop, store it in this Dropbox-like service, and then have Redshift access this Dropbox-like service and move it into ingest it and upload it into the database. So that'd be like kind of step 2. Step 3 would be to use this automation tool called Airflow. I don't know how to draw it. Let's just do it's supposed to be like a flower. I forget their, I think a pinwheel is like their icon. But this is Airflow. I'll just write it out. Okay? And Airflow will actually like make this, we can do this on a schedule. Meaning we can ask Airflow to perform the database query to our RDS instance, store the results on S3, and then connect to Redshift and ask Redshift to retrieve this data from S3 and into the database. This thing, Airflow, we'll get to it in maybe a week or so. This is called an orchestrator. Right? You can see that it kind of like is the conductor, maybe in a way, between these different services. Okay, between our database that's transactional database and S3 to then this analytics database. So this is what we'll move through over the next while. But I did want to show you like how it connects to what we've previously done. Right, what we were just working on was how do we get our stuff in the cloud to begin with? Right, we learned how to use like Docker and EC2 and RDS to do that. And then from there, now that we have a database in AWS, how do we move that data to our analytics database? And then just remember, people are going to continue accessing our application. We're going to create more users. They're going to create new tweets or whatever they're doing. So we're going to have to, we can't just move this data over once. We need to move it over every day or every week or whatever kind of suits us. All right, so this is what we're going to be moving through now. All right. Obviously, we're going to spend the next couple weeks on this process, so you don't have to absorb all of it now. But are there any questions about this? Anything you want to clear up for the time being? Yeah, Serge.
Would you call Fivetran an orchestrator too?
Okay, this is a really nice question. How do I illustrate this? Okay, let me erase this. Get your, just remember all this. It's diagrammed in the readings too. Much better probably. So, all right. So one way of thinking what we just did is, we have data from like RDS, and we use Airflow to pull that data into, here's Airflow. Airflow to pull that data into Snowflake or Redshift or whatever. Let's just put Redshift. Okay. And we have to write the SQL statement by hand in order to do that. So this process, and remember one thing, here's one thing I should state. When using Airflow, what we're about to do is not only do we have to like select this data, but remember, this is like in third normal form. When we start in our transactional database, in Redshift or in Snowflake, doesn't matter. We're going to want to move over, change the format of that data to like the star schema. Remember this? Okay. So generally, when we do it this way, all right, what we're performing is ETL, meaning that when we perform a select statement here to like export the data, we're already, and you'll see this in the lab and the reading, we're going to transform our data through SQL before we and export like this, like our new fact table, that will be exported. We're going to somehow transform the data so that we are like exporting this in this format. And this, by the time we get to the CSV, it's already going to be in this format. So we are transforming it and then loading into Redshift. And that's why it's, ETL, extract, transform, then load. Fivetran, what Fivetran will do is we have this same RDS, right? Same thing. But when it enters the analytics database, it's just going to be an exact clone of the data. All right? So you are extracting and loading directly into the database, and then you'll transform it and work on that data. So this is ELT, and this is what Fivetran does. What do you call it, an orchestrator? I don't think so. I think people will call this an extract and load tool. All right, because that's all it's really in control of. Airflow is managing these other like multiple services, right? Like it's like a scheduler, and you can really hook up any kind of Python code or these Amazon instant, like a lot of different things. This just has one job really, which is like also on a schedule, but just move the data from here to here. Okay. So these are different techniques, and we're going to go through each of them. So the first section we're going to go through is like ETL, right? Where we going to kind of have to extract our data into a CSV, then move it, then have then just move it to Redshift to begin with, eventually have Airflow perform this for us. Here, remember how easy it was? We just like put in our credentials, and it's just literally going to clone the data over here, and then we'll use DBT. So DBT fulfills the T. If there says ELT, Fivetran extracts and loads it into Snowflake or Redshift, and then we get the data, it's just an exact clone, and then we use DBT to transform this thing. All right. So in this case, it's transformed before it even enters the database. That's what we're doing now, right? We're really transforming it by the time we get to here. In this case, we just have our original data, copy it, duplicate it, put it in our analytics database, and then transform it. Okay? Yes, Rich?
So is the data in S3 already cleaned in the star schema?
Yeah, more or less. Yeah, I think classically it would be. Like honestly, people probably float between these a bit. And now people are leaning more to this ELT pattern. So maybe nowadays, no. The answer is no. But previously, back in the day, I guess yes. Now I think people are more, even if they use Airflow, may more move to this ELT pattern. Just move the data, and then we'll deal with it. All right, and we will talk. We haven't introduced ELT yet. We'll go. But we will give justifications for it and talk about why it's popular and things like that. All right. But for now, this is the pattern, and these are the tools that we're gonna have to introduce. Is like first we'll just like, okay, how do we export this data and transform it in Postgres, and then secondly, and then we have to start moving it to S3 and then to Redshift. So we have to learn about those tools. And then we have to learn about Airflow to orchestrate it, right? So this is like the next couple of weeks. Airflow will schedule this. And then we'll move into this pattern. All right? Cool. But just remember how like AWS, how what we just did fits in, right? It fits in because, well, that's where we just learned how to kind of have this Flask application that when someone interacts with our application and saves the data, it goes here. And once it goes here, then we want to move it from our transactional database to our analytics database. Cool. Other questions? All right, let's talk about the next lesson, which is how do you actually select and export this data? It turns out it's not so hard. If you think about it, all you really want to do, so we start out, let's say we are exporting customers, right? Let me show you this. So here I have my Foursquare database. So we have these, this is in, except for this guy, these are all in like third normal form, right? So we do like select all from customers. Oh, do I not have customers? Oh no. Oh, okay. I guess this was for a different thing. Let's do this for, let's say like venues. Select star from venues, limit 2. Okay. We have this Foursquare ID. How about if we do locations? Select all from locations. This might be better. All right. So you can see, like, you know, in the transactional kind of format, when we're doing third normal form, we don't want to repeat the zip code ever, right? But when we're relaxing this in OLAP, right, here we probably are not going to create a separate zip codes table just for the purpose of storing, you know, these digits. We're going to relax that a bit. So how are you going to do that? You know, how are we going to go from this format to this OLAP format? And it turns out what we can do, let's say we do like select all from locations, join zip codes, and then zip codes on locations.zipCodeID, that's spelled wrong, equals zip codes.id, let's just limit to 2. All right. So what we're starting to do is like create, what I want to do is like create this format of just the ID, location, latitude, address, and then just the zip code, the actual code here. So the way I can do that, we're starting to do it, is to do select now, let's say the locations.id, latitude, longitude, comma, address, comma, and let's just say the actual code. All right, from locations. You see that? Now, this, in theory, you know, maybe we want to also put the city there on the same table. But to start, this is fine. You can get the point. We are changing this, right? We are relaxing our third normal form, and now we are, you know, constructing a select statement, and we really want this to be our new data, okay? To insert this data into a new table, you know, we could do that. Like, we can actually insert this data into a new table in Postgres. And the way you do that is just simply wrap the select statement in an insert into statement. Okay? So say insert into, and I think we probably also need to put here the name of the table. So in theory, we would have created a new table called something like OLAP, you know, locations, that has these columns on it. And then inside this insert into statement, you just place the select. All right, so this is actually not so hard. Like the steps that you need to do is just, you know, you first create the table in the schema. So you create table OLAP locations. Then I recommend construct the select statement, get it in the output you want, and then finally wrap that select statement in an insert into OLAP locations. All right. From there, like, we can export, you know, as CSV. I can show you how to do that later, but that's not, again, like, that's pretty easy to do that. Yeah, Mike.
So would you consider this to be like a staging table?
Well, I would say, I mean, for me, it's easy to like move what I would do, I guess, in my world is like have a schema, move this in there, and then export this as as a CSV, right? That's what I would do. The other way is simply, you could just construct this query and directly export it as a CSV. That's the other way to do this. But what I want to show is, okay, like it's going to be pretty easy for us, and you will see this more with like DBT, right? It's going to be pretty easy for us to take data in one table and create a new table out of it, right? So that's kind of like one of the things I want to show. Is this like, yeah, in a way it is. The only issue is we are still in our transactional database. So I guess it's not, normally in Snowflake, for instance, the staging table would be in the analytics database. So part of this is honestly for like Petagot to show you, hey, here's a way that you can transform the data, right? And just select it in that format, right? It's, once you realize it, you realize that it's pretty obvious. And then either export this as CSV or just store it somewhere, right? And then we can move it over to our analytics database. All right, that's literally the step. So when we're all fancy about saying, okay, we're going to somehow need to transform this data, all we're really doing to transform it is just writing out a select statement, right? And then exporting the result or storing the result somehow. Yeah, David.
When you stage a table, would you, like, let's say I have a table that's millions of rows long, would you store it in a CSV before you?
Yeah, lots of times you will. Okay, so let me so let's say, let's do this. Let's erase this. And this could really be any data, that we need. This could be data that we're scraping or anything. So let's say we take our RDS data, right, and we export it as a CSV. And by the way, I would say I'm giving you for now a generic answer. We can refine this answer, maybe even in a minute. But normally you would select this data and then and then oftentimes you would stage it directly in S3. And I think lots of times what people would actually do is then transform it, okay, which I know is a little different than the format we're doing right now. Like I said, like these are in practice, like the people are practical about it. So the pattern does change from organization to organization. So you can, but the reason, let me give you some of the reasons for kind of transforming it at this stage. The reason is so that you have a record of the original data, all right, in its raw format, right? And basically that way you hold on to everything. Where maybe this would make even more sense is, say we're scraping, a bunch of HTML, like our Indeed, okay? One way we could do this is we could, scrape the page and then just literally store the raw HTML in Dropbox, right, in S3. And that way, if say, a year down the line, we're like, actually, I would, as a data scientist, I would really love to know, what was like the lower range on salary and the upper range on salary. And before we were just taking the average. Well, we have that data, right? So you want to store the raw data oftentimes, and this is pretty cheap. Like, relatively speaking, this is the cheapest part, is just storing stuff. And it just gets cheaper and cheaper, hopefully. So, yeah, storing the raw data is oftentimes what people do and then transform it, right? Where this stage, so I'm being a little, I guess, flexible with where the transformation happens. I personally think this makes the most sense, like store the raw data in S3, then transform it, and then load it into the database. What I want to show is kind of an easy way to transform the data in SQL. Because say you, because when you do it, like oftentimes, right, it will either happen in SQL or we've kind of already seen how we coerce data in Python. But normally, I think especially now, people will use SQL to do that. All right. So that's one. Okay, so this is kind of like the one answer is, okay, store it, the raw data in S3. Then when I think about like David's question specifically, well, what about like RDS, right? You might say, hey, we already have a copy of this, and maybe, because we can just like make a snapshot of it. So we don't need, like Amazon already gives us ways for free to make a backup of this. So maybe we don't have to store the raw data by hand when it comes to an actual RDS stuff, but we probably still should store raw data when it comes to data that we are scraping, like HTML, or potentially, any JSON data, right, from an API is basically what I'm thinking of, right? So data that, may have low value, like may not have a lot of value, but is like cheap, but because this is getting cheaper and cheaper, oftentimes you still store it in something. Like another example would be like logs, right? Like logs of what every user on your system ever did, right? Like a log file. We could store that on S3 as well. All right. Now, I wouldn't want to query this data necessarily. So then by the time it gets into my database, or very quickly after we enter the database, we can transform it. All right. So this, like I said, this will change. It's hard for me to give like a straight answer because you kind of just have to think through it, right? Like companies are pretty practical about it, and different companies are going to come to different patterns, right? But it's good just to think through the considerations. So like where does it make sense? We kind of identified, okay, with like HTML, or maybe like files, things that are really like files. Well, okay, and we're already not storing them otherwise. It makes sense probably to store this just in S3 because it's just a thing that now we can go back to. If we don't, I want you to understand the cost. If we do not store it somewhere and we simply transform it, then it could be that that we lost information in the transformation, right? I gave that example of, okay, we could have stored the lower range, salary and the upper range salary, the min and the max, but instead we just took the average. Well, now we lost that data forever, right? We can't go backwards a year later or whatever. So just because this is like so cheap now to store data here, this is the cheapest part. Oftentimes you'll just store the raw data here, okay? So again, like, it's about trade-offs, but so you can kind of think through, this is essentially, in this case with the RDS, all right, we already have the data here. It turns out Amazon can like let us like duplicate the hard drive just by like creating a snapshot. All right, we can get it there. We don't need to store it in S3. But with other things, we don't have that capability. We make the request.get, we have the HTML, we store it in S3. And now there's our data, okay? All right, but what I wanted to show here, just to like, is, all right, how do we transform data in SQL? Ultimately, it's not that hard. You create the table, and then you construct a select statement, and then you simply do, wrap the select statement in and insert into. So for right now, we're kind of keeping it in the same database, but ultimately we can export this data. All right, I think, let me show you. Sorry, that might be a little unsatisfying.